Welcome. We're so glad you're here with us for today's Harper Lecture. The Harper Lecture series began in 1979 with Hannah Holborn Gray speaking in San Francisco. As the need for critical thought remains apparent in all areas of life, we proudly continue this signature program to bring you stimulating conversations and fresh ideas. Thank you once more for joining us. We couldn't do this without you.
Hello, my name's Michael Rosen. I am a graduate of Chicago Booth from 2005 and honored to be a member of the university-wide alumni board. And I also have the honor of introducing our distinguished speaker today. But before we go in, let me say, isn't it great to be back? I do feel like it's very auspicious for us to be here as well, coming back, and that the first Harper Lecture was actually in San Francisco in 1979. And we have a very big tradition of welcoming speakers for evening of uniquely Chicago experience of discussion of very topical ideas and very intellectual ideas. And so I think you're going to find that Professor Meyer is a uniquely Chicago professor, although it didn't start out that way. He actually started his academic career at the safety school up in Evanston. And he's got a bachelor's and a master's degree, got a PhD from MIT, wound up teaching again at Evanston, took a little detour in Cambridge and Princeton before the strength of his research on topics of inequality, economics, wages, inflation, all these real-world society input was so strong that he finally was able to join the A-team at the Harris School at the University of Chicago. And here he continues his research tradition along the lines of Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, Eugene Fama, of looking at what the data says and then challenging the status quo and saying, we think about problems this way, let's look at the data and think of it another way. And here, poverty, homelessness, these are some of our most important problems as society. And so we are extremely honored to have Professor Bruce Meyer as our speaker today. He's going to give a talk for about 45 minutes, at which point we will open it for question and answer, not lecture and answer, question and answers. And he's in the Chicago tradition of asking tough questions. And so with that, let us welcome Professor Bruce Meyer.
So thank you, Mike, for the very kind introduction. And those comparisons and the tradition I have to uphold here are quite daunting. So I have to start out with some required statements that my comments represent my own views, not those of the Census Bureau, and that all results that I'm going to show you have been through review to prevent the unauthorized disclosure of confidential information, because I'm using restricted data for almost everything that I'm going to show you. This is also joint work, so I should acknowledge those that have helped, in particular Angela Wise, who's a real partner in this research, as well as Kevin Corinth, Alexa Grunwald, Jillian Meyer, and Derek Wu. And Mandana Vakil in the front row is recently joined the team. So you might wonder what leads someone to study those experiencing homelessness. And it was that those experiencing homelessness are among the most obviously deprived individuals that one sees in the US. That observation made me interested in homelessness, and I work on a research topic because I want to know more about it. I've been long interested in the plight of those experiencing homelessness. More than 20 years ago, I supervised a student interviewing the homeless about their income and expenditures. But unfortunately, interest in a topic isn't enough, one needs an insight as to how one can do something new. Successful research is really a coincidence of interests and opportunity. You need some angle, or what economists would call a comparative advantage at answering some important question. So I bided my time, I lurked. I didn't quite have the opportunity. I have also been interested in surveys and how they might be improved by combining them with other data, principally tax records and government program records. Our key surveys, from which I'd argue most of what we know in social science comes from, are subject to substantial error. In particular, people don't like to talk about their income. Income and the receipt of government benefits are sharply understated. One of my colleagues used to remind me that people are more willing to talk about their sex lives than their income. And he backed that up by showing me response rates on surveys that indicated that. What this figure here shows is that the current population survey, the flagship survey of the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, sharply understates certain categories of income. Almost half of unemployment insurance, sorry about all the abbreviations, there are more coming, UI is unemployment insurance, half of it's not reported. And more than half of SNAP, what is called CalFresh here, is not reported in the main Census Bureau survey. The problem has also gotten worse over time. This pattern that I'm showing you has been confirmed many different ways for many different surveys. It led me on a 15-year effort that has culminated in the Comprehensive Income Dataset Project, or KID, we call it affectionately. The Comprehensive Income Dataset Project is a big project I've been working on that combines our main national surveys from the Census Bureau with tax records and government program records like those for Social Security and SNAP. We use these to create individual histories. The work is done in a secure setting in a way that we don't see names or Social Security numbers. I've been using program data for almost 40 years, and I started this process of bringing the data together with the Census Bureau 15 years ago. We discovered that there is a lot of data on those experiencing homelessness at the Census Bureau. It just hadn't been studied. That was like the discovery of a treasure to my research team, as data are our treasure. Sometimes the research process can make us feel like a great fictitious University of Chicago professor, Indiana Jones, searching for the Holy Grail. Or maybe the real University of Chicago professors, Paul Sereno or Neil Shubin, when searching for dinosaur bones or the fossil record of an ancestral fish. Doing our research requires accessing data in a windowless office after going through 3 security doors, almost like Maxwell Smart. Fortunately, COVID had a silver lining for us in that it allowed us to access our data from our homes for a while. But that required certification that our home offices could be locked, and more interestingly, that any set of more than 4 stairs had a handrail, as our workplaces had to be safe. And this was part of the government certification process. we've begun by looking at the size of the homeless population. Fundamental questions about the size and characteristics of the U.S. homeless population are unresolved, in large part because it is unclear whether available data are sufficiently complete and reliable to give accurate answers. The typical study of those experiencing homelessness is an analysis of a few hundred individuals not scientifically selected who showed up to receive a particular set of services. We've learned a lot from this research, but it's difficult to generalize from such evidence. The existing national data is mostly from a small sample and from the 1990s. I should tell you up front, we focus on the literal homeless, those in emergency or transitional shelters, those we call the sheltered homeless, and those who usually sleep in a place not intended for human habitation. Those individuals are the unsheltered homeless, and they might be in a tent on the street, in a park, or in a car. Other definitions exist, including those precariously housed or doubled up, but I'm going to focus on the literally homeless. Most of what we know about the size of the population experiencing homelessness comes from the Housing and Urban Development PIT count, or point-in-time count. This is when I need to apologize for all the abbreviations. The point-in-time estimates are created by continuums of care, or COCs, which are local bodies charged by HUD with administering homeless services in a geographic area. COCs plan and execute a PIT count every year or every other year. The methods can include counts, surveys, and extrapolation, and often rely on volunteers, and they differ across geographic area. Efforts to evaluate this point-in-time count and its accuracy and coverage have typically been very narrow in scope, focusing on the unsheltered in a handful of cities. This figure shows the last 15 years of the HUD PIT estimates, point-in-time estimates, of the sheltered homeless population in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and the remainder of California. What you can see is that there's been a trend upward in recent years, but it's not that pronounced, and in recent years, the numbers don't reach or barely exceed the levels of 10 years ago. And that was for the sheltered, those in transitional or emergency shelters. On the other hand, this figure shows, for the same three geographic areas, the unsheltered, those living on the street or in parks or in a car. And it's clear that there's been a trend up and that we are reaching all-time highs, with a rise in LA starting in 2015 and in San Francisco in 2019. Now, those numbers differ from the US national patterns, which show a trend downward for those in shelters and a trend up nationally for those unsheltered, but the rise is not that pronounced and still below the level of 10 years ago. California sticks out because the rise has been pronounced, and for the unsheltered, a group which is very obvious to the general public. What we do is we bring to bear new data sources. This is our treasure. we use the 2010 census count of the homeless called the service-based enumeration. The census counted homeless individuals at shelters, that yields the sheltered count, and in soup kitchens, food vans, and targeted non-sheltered outdoor locations, or tinsels. Kind of a cheery name for a grim situation. And this counting took place during the last 3 days of March in 2010. We also use the American Community Survey, which is the largest regular US survey, about 1% of the population each year, about 3 million people. And we use 13 years of data from this survey, which surveyed people in emergency and transitional shelters, but not the unsheltered. Importantly, both the census and American Community Survey do not identify the homeless in their publicly available versions. So we needed to use restricted data in one of these secure windowless offices that we now use. The last source that we employ is called the Homeless Management Information System. It's microdata from just 2 cities, Los Angeles and Houston, and it tracks individuals' enrollments into and out of federally funded shelters, and many shelters that don't have federal funding. Importantly, we can link all of these sources together using anonymized codes that are on each of the records. So what do these different estimates of the sheltered homeless population look like? So initially, the different estimates look fairly different, with the HUD point-in-time count, the blue circles, indicating about 400,000 people, the 2010 census indicating about 200,000, and the American Community Survey about 200,000 till it jumped up to about 300,000 in 2011 when they incorporated new information from the 2010 census. So how do we reconcile these different estimates? Well, it turns out that the HUD definition of homelessness includes people in quite a few facilities that the census didn't consider to be homeless shelters, or didn't include them in their numbers. In particular, domestic violence shelters, safe havens, which are supportive housing for those with mental illness, and voucher-funded motel rooms and beds in non-shelter facilities. So what we do is we add estimates of these groups to our estimates from the census, and then we are able to reconcile about half of the difference between the census and the HUD point-in-time count. So the adjusted estimate, including these categories that have been left out, is indicated by the green triangle here. So there are other changes we need to make. The American Community Survey upweights people who are homeless to account for other people that they left out of the survey, because they want the data, when you use it to represent the entire country and they leave out other categories. So we have to undo this, and when we do that, that counterbalances the change in definition that I just talked about. So we kind of end up back where we started, with an estimate that's about 3/4 of what the Department of Housing and Urban Development comes up with. So we're getting closer. The last thing that we do is we apply another approach for the sheltered homeless that provides an independent check on the numbers. And this is an approach that's sometimes called dual systems methods. It's widely used in demography and other fields to obtain a reliable estimate of a population size under certain conditions. In ecology, it goes by the name mark and recapture or capture and recapture. It's a fundamental part of what the census does to figure out how many people they missed every 10 years in the census. So it's part of the undercount analysis that they do. The basic idea is you use two systems or samples, and the method multiplies the size of a first sample by the inverse of the share of those in a second sample who are also found in the first. Okay, so the first system here is the census sheltered homeless count. The second is people in administrative shelter records on the day of the census count. So with some modification, what we do is we multiply the census sheltered count by the inverse of the share of people in our administrative shelter records who are found by the census in shelters. So my staff said I had to show one equation. So here's an equation describing what I just said. Okay. We need to make one more adjustment because the data that we get on when people are in shelters from the administrative records from HUD are subject to a lot of error in the early years. So a quick way to see that is this is showing the number of people according to these records in homeless shelters on a weekly basis starting in 2009, and also the capacity of these shelters. And you'll see in the early years there are more people than the capacity. So we know something's wrong, and eventually they started to bother to write down correct exit dates starting around 2012. And so we need to make some adjustment for this, and we have I think a good way of doing it. So in the end, we use this approach and we get an estimate for the U.S. sheltered homeless population that's indicated by the maroon square here, which is very close to what HUD estimated a very different way. And we conclude that we think probably our maroon square is really close to the truth, but that about 400,000 people are in homeless shelters in a typical night across the country. So we can also apply our different methods to the Los Angeles shelter count. That's the blue circles here, and you can see that our two methods pretty much bracket the blue circle in 2010 for LA. So again, we think we're getting pretty good numbers from these sources. Now, what do these new data tell us about the characteristics of those experiencing homelessness? Now that we've kind of checked some of the basic features of the data to make sure that they make sense. I'll generally show you what we learn about the US and California, and to put the numbers in perspective, because it's hard to know whether a number is big or small, I'll refer to what you would get if you calculated that number for the single-housed poor or all those who are housed. So what you see here is that the US homeless population is older than the single-housed poor, but very few are 65 and older. California's sheltered homeless population is especially old, with more than 50% between the ages of 45 and 64. The US homeless population is more Black and less Hispanic than the single-housed poor. Blacks are heavily overrepresented among the homeless population. California's sheltered homeless population is more white, but not more Hispanic than the US homeless population. That might surprise you. Part of the answer is there is a very large Puerto Rican homeless population in New York City. Another basic characteristic of those experiencing homelessness is where they've lived in the past. And many mayors and governors think that the homeless have moved to their jurisdiction because of the generous social services they provide or good weather. What do the data say? Well, the American Community Survey asks where you were born and where you lived a year ago. So we can use those questions to look at the long-term and short-term migration of those in shelters. So here, these on the left, it's migration since birth, and on the right, it's migration over the last year. The blue dot part of the bar tells you who are in the same state as they were when they were born on the left and a year ago on the right. The orange gives you the share of people who changed state either since birth on the left or in the last year on the right. And then the cross-hatched area is the share of people who changed countries, that they're the immigrants. We see moderate rates of geographic mobility, but not terribly high rates for the homeless population, not that different from the housed, at least since birth. In the last year, we see quite a bit higher migration rates. So homeless individuals have more likely changed states in the last year than others, but not that much more likely to have changed states since birth. California's sheltered homeless population is less mobile, only about 7.5% moved states in the last year compared to 11% nationally, but significant part of that is due to California being a big state. So the bottom line is, in the end, most homeless individuals are homegrown. They're not, they haven't moved in to take advantage of SNAP or Medicaid or good weather. Other characteristics that people ask about are veteran status and disabilities. We see a moderate veteran share nationally, 8%, but one that is higher in California, 13%. We see high rates of physical and cognitive limitations of various kinds of disabilities. Nationally, 36%, slightly higher in California at 40%. In a few minutes, you'll see that a large share of the homeless are on one of the federal disability programs, but it's not most of the homeless. Unfortunately, the surveys we have don't ask about drug or alcohol use, so I can't tell you about those important issues. You might ask, how are these individuals getting by? And we seek to understand the material circumstances of those experiencing homelessness, including the long-term patterns of deprivation and safety net use. We do this by linking homeless individuals from the 2010 census to administrative data to provide the first national calculations of this population's formal employment, income, and connections to various government programs. The way that we do that is we link their records to tax records, including 1040s and W-2s, information on the receipt of SNAP, TANF, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, Social Security benefits, veterans benefits, and housing assistance. The key findings are that, quite surprising to many, nearly all sheltered homeless, 97%, and the vast majority of unsheltered homeless individuals have either formal earnings or receipt of some government benefit, so some connection to formal institutions. But their income tends to be very low. So formal income, median of $5,500 for the unsheltered, $7,500 a year for the sheltered. Nearly half of all homeless individuals, surprising to some, have formal employment that shows up on tax records, but their earnings tend to be very low. Among those who work, only about $8,000 a year. So those numbers are for 2010, when we observed this large sample of almost 500,000 homeless individuals. But we then look over time for this group, for 4 years before and 6 years after. Their median income, including the value of food stamps and housing benefits, which they often get for part of the year, the value of that is always below $10,000, the median, over the 4 years prior and 6 years after a person is observed homeless in our data. There are small and transitory changes in employment and earnings around an observed homeless spell, but the period right around the homeless spell that we see doesn't really stick out that much. A moderate share of homeless individuals, 20% of the sheltered, 30% of the unsheltered, have disability benefits, and that share grows over time. In summary, journalists like to talk about individuals who are temporarily homeless, but the vast majority of those experiencing homelessness are not having a bad year, but what I would characterize as a bad life. Looking more in detail, this figure shows government benefits and formal employment in the year 2010, the year that we observed these individuals homeless. We see moderate receipt of disability programs like veterans' disability benefits, disability insurance from Social Security and supplemental security income. HUD benefit receipt is also low, but Medicaid is an important benefit. About half of the sheltered and 40% of the unsheltered had Medicaid, and similar numbers for earnings, with a little over half having formal earnings, half of the sheltered and 40% of the unsheltered. The most common benefits that these individuals receive is food stamps, about over 80% for the unsheltered, 70% for the sheltered. I'm sorry, other way around. Over 80% for the sheltered, 70% for the unsheltered. Almost 90% of the sheltered are receiving some government benefit, and about 80% of the unsheltered. Now, what does the pattern look like over time? This is the share of sheltered in blue, unsheltered in orange triangles that have formal earnings. And it's generally around 50%, drifting down over time. What we found striking is there's a little bit of a dip before we see people homeless in our data in 2010, but it's not that pronounced. There's some indication of a small shock that has led these individuals to become homeless, but it doesn't really stick out. And if you look at median income, including in-kind benefits, so that's including the value of SNAP and housing benefits that they might get. And here, this figure's a little complicated. After 2010, we're able to add in supplemental security income, which goes to poor disabled individuals. And that makes a big difference here, but still, this group never has median earnings over $10,000. What do we see when we look at California and LA? Slight differences from those national patterns, that in California, both the sheltered and unsheltered are less likely to have formal employment, but are more likely to get disability benefits, but they're not that different from the national patterns. So let me summarize things here and then talk a little bit about conclusions. So we use these novel sources of data that are designed to represent the U.S. homeless population, including the unsheltered, and we link them to administrative data. These linkages allow us to provide the first rigorous examination of fundamental questions like population size and income and safety net participation over time. We confirm that the sheltered homeless population is a little under 400,000 and the unsheltered population is a little over 200,000, though there is likely some undercounting of the unsheltered, and there have been some recent reshuffling of the particularly the unsheltered across the country. we find that the vast majority of the U.S. homeless population is connected to work and or the safety net, but that severe material deprivation persists over many years. One other finding that I should mention is that this very low income that you see for this population over more than a dozen years that we examine is consistent with the little bits of experimental evidence that we have that indicate that small amounts of money to those at risk of homelessness who say contact a hotline when they're having difficulty paying rent or other bills, small amounts of money to individuals in that situation has been found to dramatically reduce the risk of homelessness, and that's consistent with this population having very low income long term, and there just being a small dip when they are literally homeless. We are now planning to set out on additional work that will look at the migration and geographic mobility of the homeless, their mortality, and their transitions between various housing states. Those are some of the topics that we're headed to examine in the next months and years. So let me stop here and take questions. There are microphones on either side of the room that I'd encourage you to get over to walk over to, and please ask questions, because I know this is an important issue in San Francisco especially.
Thank you for your lecture. This is so great. The data set you built is extraordinary. I wanted to ask, people debate the geographic differences in homelessness across the country. And why is it so bad in New York and California and maybe, the middle of the country, it's not so bad. And, you're an expert, and I'm just tossing out ideas that I read on probably social media or whatever, but you hear stories about housing prices as a driving force of, homelessness. So if it's New York, California, Hawaii, high housing prices will drive homelessness. And then also California, I guess there's more of a right to be homeless. I mean, and there are certain places in New York where it's, if you're homeless, it's, you're asked to go to a shelter or go to a jail, or in California, it's different. So thank you.
Sure, that's obviously a really important question. When people have looked at the relationship between homelessness across cities and rents, they find a relationship, but it's not that tight, it's not that pronounced. So I think it's part of the story, but it doesn't seem to be the main story. And in New York City, there is a right to shelter. So the city has to provide a homeless shelter for anyone who needs it. And the shelters for families in particular, they're not really shelters, they're apartments. And they're not that undesirable. In fact, they're pretty desirable. So I think that there's part of the story is that it's not as bad to be homeless in New York City, and there are, as a result, more individuals who are homeless. So if you look at the data, there is some indication that people who wouldn't be homeless other places are on the margin between choosing their housing status there. And it does look like there is a greater number of people in New York City, in part because it's not as unattractive to be homeless there. So
it's interesting that the Ninth Circuit, covering California and the Western United States, has ruled that you're entitled to sleep on the streets. Mayor Koch in New York was really clear when he said, you really can't defecate on the streets. And California has not been able to really deal with that issue. In San Francisco, the budget is something like $750 million a year. And my question is, for you, from your research, which I very much appreciate, is there a homeless industry that supports and promotes and does not fully resolve this disparate resolution of income? And I have to say that my bias is Northern European, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish style of government that provides a substantial safety net. And I really don't see it here, and I don't see it unfolding. And I'd like you to comment on that. And also the current plans of Governor Newsom to institute a, quote, care courts to provide some impetus for supporting social services and for people who are find themselves living on the streets.
You've asked some really hard questions, and I don't know all of the local efforts by any means. But I think you need to figure out a good alternative for people who are sleeping on the streets. And the evidence, I will say, in terms of temporary solutions, there's many attempts at something called rapid rehousing, which is just to try and get people off the streets into housing short term. The evidence on that is not that encouraging in terms of getting people to not be homeless long term. The only thing that we have some substantial evidence that it seems to work, but it's pretty high cost, is providing permanent public or subsidized housing. And we don't seem to be headed in that direction. And if we're going to do that, we probably have to be quite targeted in providing those long-term housing benefits to those who are likely to become homeless. We have a lot of public and subsidized housing in the country, but it's not well targeted to those that are really needy. It's more spread around so that only a small share of those that are eligible, about a quarter, receive public and subsidized housing, but that's because a very large share of the low-income population is in principle eligible. So I guess I would suggest that those funds could be more targeted towards those who are especially needy and likely to be homeless. And personally, I'd like to see rules enforced in terms of requirements of public, I don't know what's the right phrase, public decency, or to make our cities more livable, but that has to come along with an alternative for those experiencing homelessness, an alternative for them to live safely someplace. So.
In your slides, you mentioned that a significant portion of the homeless population is older, and I was wondering if there were specific characteristics you found that might suggest what the driver of that is, or any important characteristics, and whether it's changed over time.
Good question. You see that disability is closely related to being homeless, and both cognitive and physical disabilities, and those tend to get worse over time for people. So that's part of what's going on here, certainly. There is some research that argues that was a cohort, a particular group of people, I guess, born mostly in the 50s, that have high rates of homelessness, 50s and 60s, and that's part of what we've been working through in many cities. But that can't be most of the story. So I hadn't really pondered this a lot. That's something that I should think more about, but certainly disability and the fact that the years in people's 40s and early 50s tend to be a period when a lot of disabilities show up and become pronounced, is likely to be a big part of what's going on.
Hi. Oh, go ahead.
Please.
A couple comments. I found the slide where you showed participation in TANF and general assistance sort of very interesting tell that, that's for people who aren't familiar with sort of the terminology. Those are the primary cash welfare programs for families and individuals. TANF being a federal program, but run by the states and with a wide degree of latitude. And 25 years ago, at the point of welfare reform, about 2/3 of TANF money, there's about $32 billion in TANF money a year, 16 billion fed, 16 billion matched by the states. About 2/3 was spent on direct assistance. Now only about 20% is goes to direct assistance to the families. And so states have driven down caseloads, and the presumption, I think the general accepted notion is that they've driven them down because they can drive people off the caseloads, not necessarily because they're actually financially self-sustaining. General assistance is another interesting one that here, at least here in California, it's run by counties and it's run by county money. And from what I've seen over the last 25 years, counties have put up a lot of barriers to participation. Work requirements, time limits, in addition to calling it a loan program instead of a grant. So in theory that they could try and collect money later, and which I don't think they ever really do, but and reducing the grant. So I always find it interesting that on the one hand, counties are spending money on homeless services while they were trying to save money on general assistance, which is the cash. So I often wonder, it would be an interesting thing to look at, which is how much of an impact at least in California, I can't speak for other states, but how much of an impact is it that driving down the financial resources of people the most in risk has helped drive the homeless problem?
So there's a lot there in what you went through, and I think I would distinguish between a few different segments of the population, and that I think you might be onto something in that general assistance has been historically targeted at single individuals. And in our other research, not specifically focused on the homeless, we seem to find that single individuals are a group that seems to have been missed by our safety net programs. So we find that a very large share of those at the extreme bottom of the income distribution are single individuals because we have a lot of programs for single parents, we still have TANF, SNAP has been expanded, SSI reaches a lot of low-income families, and our tax credits, earned income tax credit, child tax credit, are especially targeted to low-income families, but there really isn't that much specifically targeted at single individuals. And general assistance was historically that program, and it's not uniform. It's a state program. Some places it's generous, some places it isn't. And I suspect that is closely related to the increase in homelessness in some areas. Now, you've kind of hit on also an area where my other research takes a pretty strong stand. And you kind of have baited me a little bit, so I'm going to talk about it. And so the conventional wisdom on the left may be most poignantly stated by Daniel Patrick Moynihan in response to welfare reform of the 90s, was that it was going to lead to, as he put it, children sleeping on grates and being found in the morning frozen. That, I think, turned out to be resoundingly rejected by the data. There was, and this is something that I've been arguing for 20 years, actually. And what we did is we looked at consumption patterns of single-parent families and found that in terms of food and clothing and housing, that they were able to buy across the distribution. Things improved after welfare reform. So the worry was, so I have to tell you a little bit about what happened in welfare reform, going back, that we shifted the safety net from one that was unconditional on work to one that was conditional on work. So we cut benefits for those who weren't working, but we expanded Medicaid, child care, expanded the earned income tax credit. Later, we added the child tax credit and expanded it, so that we saw more than 1 million single parents who hadn't been working in the early 90s. By 2000 were working. And there was a lot of support for work at that time, and still is. And that the forecasts of those, even at the very bottom, doing quite poorly after welfare reform, you just didn't see in the patterns of the consumption data. I will say we argued this, and not many people were paying attention, but then in the last few years, it's become conventional wisdom that welfare reform kind of worked. And there was even a piece in the New York Times just a month ago describing the research of child trends that showed that child poverty had fallen 60% since that time. And I don't think that those data quite well capture it, because as I showed you on one of the early slides, our income surveys are increasingly doing a bad job of capturing income at the bottom. Just people don't want to respond to surveys. So more than half of cash welfare for single parents isn't reported. More than half of SNAP isn't reported. And a lot of labor earnings isn't reported. And we can see this when we bring in tax records and government program records. So I guess in short, I think that yes, for the problems of single individuals, but in terms of families, I think the shift in programs has actually been quite favorable, because it's involved a shift to people supporting themselves through work, which has been, the changes have been quite remarkable, with previously about 40% of high school educated or less single mothers working, to now 70%, and poverty rates in that group going way down. So, okay, that was a very long answer.
The data you presented on homelessness seems to have little correlation with economic cycles. Can you comment on that? Why is it that we don't see the 2007 housing crisis in your data and other aspects of the economic cycle?
You do see a little bit of a tick up. I probably could find that figure, but you're right, it's not that pronounced. I think the story is that, where was that figure? I'm sorry. This one. Yeah, there's a little bit of a tick up in the Great Recession, but it's not that pronounced. I think it's because these individuals are really deprived. It's disabilities and mental and physical. It's also drug addiction, and those basic issues aren't that sensitive to the general growth rate in the economy.
Excuse me, in your presentation, I didn't see a lot or any mention very much of the criminal justice system and homelessness.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if you've looked at things like that and some of the efforts that the reforms in our incarceration system, especially for those who've just been arrested and are awaiting trial and can't make bail. They get in, they lose their housing, they lose income, and they're into that track. And I just didn't know if you have some comments about that.
Let me just quickly say that's a very important connection. Thanks for asking that question. And that's something we're hoping to really add to the mix in the future, that we see that individuals who were homeless previously were often in jail or prison, and often people that are homeless down the road are in jail and prison. So there really is a connection that's important.
Hi, thanks for all the information. Can you help explain the dramatic increase in unsheltered homelessness in the Bay Area? Unsheltered homelessness goes up in your data. It goes up to anyone living here. Anyone who walked to this venue encountered unsheltered homeless. But if it's not correlated to housing, and if it's not correlated to economics, what's driving it? Thanks.
Well, housing has got to be part of the story, but it doesn't seem to be what drives the national patterns. I think those are really good questions, and I don't really have a simple answer besides housing is probably part of that problem. I think we also need to look at programs for single individuals, the kind of support that is provided for that demographic. Don't have a lot else to say on that. Yeah.
I have two questions that are distinct, so I'll ask them separately. So the first one is on the slide that you shared about, what are the social security, the Medicare, the percentages of people who are using those services. Obviously, that's going to be heavily biased by the demographics that you have. You shared about how the elderly population was a greater percentage of that. So when you condition on the age groups, do you still see the effect that a much more higher than proportionate percentage of people are using these services?
So we haven't done a lot to look at the role of age per se, and that's something that we probably should think about exploring more. So thank you. I think that has to be one more question.
So the second question that I have is with regards to, how can you use this data to influence what else should be happening? Like towards the end of the slide, you talk about how, there are some things that you notice in the data in terms of what could reduce homelessness, what are certain events that could be focusing on. And part of this, where I'm coming from, is that I'm working with a homeless shelter in Oklahoma City that focuses on the youth. And we're looking at, what can we provide to them, whether that is life skill services, that's getting them their GED, that's getting them into transitional housing, so that we can get them out of homelessness into a house. What is it that we should be focusing on that will help lower homelessness now and into the future?
Tough question. I don't have good answers. I just read a review of various programs that have been tried to reduce homelessness. And and the programs that have been rigorously evaluated, there isn't a lot of success stories in what's been evaluated. There's been some evidence that small amounts of money to people that are having trouble paying rent can make a big difference. But in terms of people that are already homeless, there isn't much evidence on anything besides providing permanent housing for them in terms of what clearly works. So I'll stay around, and I'm happy to talk with people after, but I think we have to end the formal session now. So. Thank you very much.
So once again, I'd like to thank Professor Meyer for joining us. This was an evening of education on a very important topic and also an evening of connection. And I think his coming brought us all here as well, so thank you very much. And thank you all for attending, making this such a great evening.